First of all, thank you all for being here. I believe everyone's time is valuable, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And I want to say a few words about why I wrote the book, and then I'll conclude by reading from it. And I'm actually going to start with the conclusion when I do that reading, and I'll explain why. But I wrote this book because I'm very interested in problem solving. And there were several issues that I take on in the book, both as it pertains to, as Emily just said, ethics, but moral issues, but even social issues or personal issues. So a lot of this book is very personal. If you can read between the lines, not everything, but there are some things when I think about mental health, for instance, which is in the book, or I think about the impact of psychology and even music in our world, for instance, that's in the book. And there was a lot of music in the background as I was writing this book. Even there's a moment where I bring in Michael Jackson's 1991 song, Black or White. I was just listening to that one day when I was walking, and I was like, wait, he's wrong. And then I just was like, how do I incorporate that into the book? And how do I think about it in terms that can maybe register with people who are into music, who like this song, and also who can see while his vision in the song is a worthy one, it's not exactly the world that we live in yet. It's a hopeful dream though, and I hope we can live in that world one day. And so there's a lot, as I said in the book, but I'm starting with the conclusion also because I believe that in the end is the beginning with this book. And as you'll see once I read from it, there's a letter at the end that I wrote when I was 18 years old, because I was being racially profiled by police in my neighborhood. And that was a very traumatic experience, as you'll probably be able to pick up from the letter. But I was then trying to think, someday I want to publish that letter. But I don't want to do it on Twitter because no one might read it, but also that can come and go, whereas something like this in a Cambridge University Press book, and I'm immensely grateful to Emily, to Emma, the marketing exec, and everyone at Cambridge, including folks at the bookshop, for supporting the work and also for allowing me to be here today. But that letter was something, when I think about trauma, for instance, that was generated for me from that experience, or I think about just the mental health conversations that I had to have. It's like, how can I get to that letter through Shakespeare? So that was one of the questions, and then one of the problems that I wanted to solve for myself. And it was not an easy route to figure that out, but I get to this letter by way of the Comedy of Errors. So that's the final play that I deal with in the book as I think about just what's going on there in that play in terms of mistaken identity, right? But then also we can take that a step further and think about how these characters who are being mistaken for one another are being profiled in a way because of someone's perceived ideas about who they are. And so that's really where this ends. And so without further ado, I'm going to read from the conclusion, which draws on the title of Shakespeare's play. And so the conclusion is called, I promise you I wrote this book. I'm like, what is it called? It's called Artifactually, the Comedy of Terrors. And so this last section of the book is DWB, Sincerely a Frustrated Citizen. As I conclude this book, I think of James Baldwin, who asserts in Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare that his relationship then to the language of Shakespeare revealed itself as nothing less than his relationship to himself and his past. The same is true for me. While growing up in late 20th century, predominantly low-income South Norwalk, Connecticut, which was deeply affected by the police magnets that were the crack epidemic of the 1980s and the gang activity perpetrated by the Latin Kings and other organized groups in the 1990s, I learned about violent death by age 4 or 5, definitely by 1989. Well before I knew anything about Shakespeare and how his early modern tragedies would teach me about senseless murder and centuries-old anti-Black violence. Even though I did not have the sophisticated technical language to articulate my perceptions of the world as a child, I learned empirically that bullets and guns and the people who use them do irreparable physical, emotional, and psychological harm. as they inflict damage on the human body. Growing up within the Du Boisian Vale in my Connecticut hood, prior to its faux posh capitalistic rebranding as Sono, and its subsequent 21st century gentrification that made it more palatable and safe for white people, I learned, contrary to Michael Jackson's 1991 racial equality anthem, that it does indeed matter if you're Black or white. I learned that the notion of bullets not having names on them is utterly false, as it never seems that way for people with Black skin, Black boys and girls, Black women and men. This was hood pedagogy. Thus, I grew up and sometimes still lived wrapped tightly in anxiety, with the fear that the bullets will find me because of whatever I am doing while Black. It don't matter what. Even now, very now, I could simply be reading, teaching, or writing about Shakespeare when the bullet suddenly becomes the trigger. Imagine that. For that reason alone, I was acutely aware, and need you to be acutely aware, of how much was at stake in producing this book. The stakes for me, my parents, my family, my culture, my race, my field, my students, my colleagues, and even you. Even in times when I allowed life to get in the way, I had to be careful, remaining aware of the not so simple fact that there is always a bullet ready to have my name on it. All I have to do is make the one wrong move, the one move that becomes the right move for the trigger to be pulled, so I then bleed out like my Black brethren, David McCatty, Alton Sterling, Michael Brown. Whatever I'm doing while Black, it rarely ceases to feel like I am dodging bullets in this comedy of terrors that does not keep the law away from breaking Black people like me, even when we do not break the law. If at times this book reads as though it was written like my life depended on it, make no mistake about your assumption. Truthfully, I sometimes feel like I am on the dramatic trajectory of one of Shakespeare's tragic protagonists. Act 5 is inevitable, and I am running out of time. We are running out of time. For me, one of the most distressing things about being a Black adult, if I am to be frank, is living daily with a traumatic, infantilizing childhood fear that the bullets will find me, no matter what I am doing while Black. Hence the sense of urgency around getting these ideas out of my body. I could not let them die, not with me. I must die without them. Thus, with this presentation of one last artifact, I explicitly want to drive this conversation back to the comedy of terrors, what I see as a genre of racial misfortune for Black people and for white people and those with internalized whiteness whose racist delusions or systemic suppression of the truth keep reality at a distance. I feel inclined to conclude this book by sharing a poignant story as it touches on many of the topics I converge in this study. I use my final chapter as the vehicle to publish and share this story, my story, because in many ways it inspired and informed the critical, personal, experiential nature of this book. Moreover, I share this story to situate it in conversation with the intersecting critical, personal, experiential, anti-racist discourses within pre-modern critical race studies, Shakespeare studies, genre studies, critical whiteness studies, social psychology, Black male studies, Black feminist studies, sound studies, and other fields and spaces devoted to undoing white supremacy while exploring racial formation. In 2001, as a 17-year-old Black kid from South Norwalk on the verge of adulthood, I found myself in a position all too familiar for people who share the somatic mark of Blackness, especially in America. That is, driving, my very first car, mind you, while Black. Repeatedly stopped 4 times by 3 different police officers over the course of 6 months between December 2001 to June 2002, during my senior year of high school, I, a Black adolescent, responded to antagonistic police the safest way I felt I could. I wrote. I penned a letter for my future and the futures of people in my neighborhood who looked like me. With stories of anti-Black police violence sealed within the book and volume of my brain, then, I penned a letter, quite literally, to save my life, or at least buy me more time, in hopes that I would not one day find myself in the terrifying, tragic position of Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, or Philando Castile. Black body, Black person, riddled with police bullets. While the what ifs I anxiously allude to in the letter's conclusion have yet to become my reality, the same is not true for so many Black people mentioned in this book, and not mentioned in this book. With the permission of my vulnerable teenage self, to whom I dedicate this book in part, I end Shakespeare's White Others here by sharing with you an early 21st century letter I wrote to the police commissioner, mayor, and police chief of my hometown, South Norwalk, Connecticut, a place that after 2002 has not fully felt quite safe like home. And the subject of this letter is Larson Street internal two-way conflict. I, David S. Brown, am an 18-year-old African-American who lives on Larson Street in Norwalk. I have been stopped 3 different times by police officers for committing an alleged traffic offense. I say alleged because there seems to be a misunderstanding in regard to definition. On September 29, 2001, I was stopped by a police officer as I was on my way out of the street toward the intersection of Larson and South Main Street. The police officer stopped next to my car and told me that Larson was a one-way. I attempted to tell him that it was not, but he insisted that he was correct. I didn't argue. He let me go and gave me a warning. I later told my father, who went down to the police station on December 31st and gave a copy of the attached diagram, which is included in the book, from the Norwalk Traffic Authority to Officer Yolanda, who was at the front desk. Having never had this problem before, my father assumed that would be enough. 3 months later, I was stopped on March 22nd, 2002, around 9 p.m. This officer was the same one who stopped me in December. Having given me a warning in December, he took action this time. He told me that I must back up my car and turn around. Annoyed at the situation, I backed my car into my driveway and sat there. His vehement tone troubled my nerves, and as I backed my car up, I hit the passenger side rearview mirror on my gate. My car was slightly damaged because of an incident that should have never occurred. Approximately 6 hours later, the day now being March 23rd, Officer Evans stopped me for the 3rd time. She stopped me for committing this alleged traffic violation, going the wrong way out of a one-way. This time I was prepared, so I thought. I had the attached paper from the Norwalk Traffic Authority that clearly explains, with coherent words and a simple diagram, the legal way for traffic to flow in and out of Larson Street. When she finally came to my car, she asked me, "Whose car is this?" She also asked me, "Why is she, my then girlfriend, in the back seat?" A question that I feel in no way related to the reason I was stopped. I hesitantly answered her anyway. Once again, my nerves were shaken. I had just been stopped for the same alleged infraction hours before. This was also mentioned to Officer Evans, who had an obvious lack of interest in any of my comments. When I showed her the paper from the Norwalk Traffic Authority, she said, "Okay, this paper is dated from 1998. She claimed that the paper was not valid because it was from 1998. This I did not understand because it was still the same street. The Constitution was created in 1789, so does this mean that it too is not valid? She ultimately issued me a ticket for committing this alleged traffic offense. Later that morning, my father had a telephone conversation with Officer Lysaby in regard to the incident. He also spoke to Officer Evans' supervisor, Sergeant Katori, in the afternoon around 4:15 p.m. Sergeant Katori assured my father and I that the situation would be taken care of. 3 months later, on June 23, 2002, another male officer stopped me again at about 12 in the afternoon. He pulled up next to my car and said, "Do you know that this is a one-way?" I answered him confidently, saying, "No, it is not." He said, "Yes, it is. So I think you need to turn around before someone comes by and messes up your ride." Tired of playing the "yes it is, no it is not" game, I complied with the officer's request because this situation, quite frankly, has made my nerves weary. He waited at the end of Larson and Woodward until he saw me turn my car around, and then he left. I must add that I did not feel as though I were being spoken to as if I were the intelligent individual that I am. I guess he assumed that by me being a teenager from South Norwalk, I would comprehend those words better, words that I felt were demeaning. Larson is not a one-way. It never has been. In 1998, 4 years ago, the Norwalk Traffic Authority placed do not enter signs at the intersection of Larson and Woodward Avenue. I do not understand why it has been a problem now. By the straightforward laws of definition, Larson Street was no longer a two-way street because of the do not enter signs. Thus, it became an internal two-way street in 1998. There are no one-way signs on any of the four corners of Larson Street. There never have been. In order for any street to be a one-way, it must fit the definition of that type of street. Larson Street does not. The fact that I have been stopped 4 times is indicative of the failure of some individuals' ability to observe the definition of a simple term, respect common citizens, and reason logically and socially. I appear to be a typical male from the hood, frequently wearing a do-rag to cover my braids. I am not. It seems to be too much of a coincidence that I am the only individual on my street that has ever been stopped by police for this alleged traffic offense. I'm the only one who looks like me. I hope I am not being profiled. I look forward to my complaint being dealt with. I want my words to be read, not looked at. I want this situation to be mollified, not ignored. I want the irritation and aggravation to end before any hypothetical situation that is fathomable occurs. So please, let's take care of this before the what-ifs become reality. A frustrated citizen, David S. Brown. So that letter was my inroad into this book, which does a range of things. But as far as the concept of Shakespeare's white others is concerned, and so it's like, how do you get there from that letter? I'm really thinking about in-group, out-group, those kinds of dichotomies in our world that create these processes of inclusion and exclusion. And so the figure of the white other, which I see in plays, well, it's in all the plays, but in the book, I think of the Comedy of Errors, right? I think of Hamlet, Antony and Cleopatra, Titus Andronicus, and Othello, for instance, and Macbeth. I'm really interested in sort of isolating moments in these plays where we're not interested in thinking about how is race impacting a figure like Othello, for instance. How is it impacting the characters who don't look like Othello? That makes sense. And so with Macbeth, for instance, I begin the play or the book with a little acknowledgement of that play by thinking about how even Macbeth, who is referred to in the middle of that play as Black Macbeth, after he's become this sinful murderer who's committed treasonous actions, he's no longer in that position that he was in at the beginning of the play. There's this shift in his character, and a lot of it has to do with, even as Shakespeare calls attention to, this blackening of Macbeth, who is a white character. And so Shakespeare's white others allows us to see how racial dynamics are at play, not interracially, because we already know that, but intraracially. And that's really where I guess I'll end, and love to have questions from you. If anyone's read the book, I know you have. I was just talking with him earlier. He actually shared it. His students read it. They're 17, 18 years old. And so I was really happy to hear that, because I wrote this book as, you know, it's an academic book, but I wrote it in a way that I would say, as I tell everybody, I wanted to write a book that my parents could read. I come from a working class background. My father's a school bus driver, for instance. So they're not 4-year degree, college educated PhD people, but that doesn't matter. And so this book is also a book that I hope dispels for people that fear that they have of getting into Shakespeare. So another reason that I put so many different topics into it is because if psychology is your thing, or if, I don't know, there's so many topics, music, like I said before, feminism is in the book, but really whatever your inroad is, I'm just interested in people engaging with the work. And so